Go ahead.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members. So I have two proposals before the committee today, and they both relate to the establishment of a task force. You may recall in the fall that two young women came forward to report situations of inappropriate conduct this fall. One individual reported inappropriate conduct of a DFL senator, and another young woman reported inappropriate conduct of a Republican state House representative. And both of those individuals have since resigned, and we've had special elections. At the time that those young women came forward, one of the issues that they brought to light is that there is not a reporting mechanism for people who don't work here at the legislature. We subsequently found out that there was additional inappropriate conduct by the Republican representative that involved a lobbyist. And the lobbyist really had no mechanism by which to come forward and report what she felt was inappropriate conduct. Because to come forward means that all of a sudden everybody knows who's complaining about whom, and then, will that lobbyist ever get a hearing again in front of that committee or other sympathetic committee chairs committees? So we clearly had a problem that we needed to address, which is evidenced by the resignation and subsequent special election in two positions in the Minnesota legislature in 2017 and 2018. So in looking at this issue, the young women who came forward suggested that we form a task force, and they sent that request that we form a task force to all of the leaders of the House and the Senate, the leaders of the two major political parties, and to the governor. And the proposal was extremely well crafted in calling upon employment law professionals and human resources professionals to take a look at our existing system and to determine whether we need to create a new mechanism for people outside the entity, given that two of the three complainants in the fall were people who were not employees of the House or the Senate. I thought it was an eminently reasonable suggestion. It would have cost us nothing, still would cost us nothing. And I think the testimony from the lawyers who've been before this committee so far have shown us that they have a wealth of knowledge and expertise in the field that we simply don't possess. This legislative session, we have 13 weeks, 12 if you take the week out that we're off for Easter. We have a $329 million surplus to figure out what to do with. We have an enormous, complicated issue of federal tax conformity in front of us, the opioid epidemic, the MNLARS debacle, and this issue deserves careful thought and attention. And I think that outside professionals have better experience and expertise to do this work than we do, especially in the very limited time that we're here in St. Paul in 2018. My experience is 23 years practicing law. My first few years out of law school, I was at the Legal Aid Society, where I sued landlords who were accused of racial, sexual, or disability discrimination. Then I went on to work in private firms, including my own, and the Ryder Bennett Law Firm, where I mainly represented individuals who were accused of discrimination, but also represented plaintiffs. And I spent a couple years at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office doing employer harassment and discrimination training and defense work. For 10 years, I practiced employment law at a private company where I did the annual trainings on anti-harassment and anti-discrimination. And throughout the 23 years I've been practicing, I've taught several CLEs on harassment and discrimination. And in that experience, I know there is a robust community of professionals in Minnesota who work on these issues day in and day out, and that their expertise and their knowledge would be very helpful to us. They also have the day-to-day practical interaction with these facts on the ground. This is all they do, all day, every day. They represent employers large and small. We feel here at the legislature that we have a unique institution and we have unique problems with sexual harassment and discrimination, but we're not unlike other entities. We have the media and lobbyists interacting with us. Those are like outside vendors for other companies. And we have our constituents, and those are like other companies' customers. So I don't think that our problems are really that unique, and I think the professional experiences that the human resources professionals in the Twin Cities and the employment law professionals in the Twin Cities have could really inform us. Finally, I think if we had an outside task force, we would get better input from the people who are concerned about our culture, but who are also concerned about retaliation. We know that this committee has asked the lobbying community to testify, and they have politely declined the opportunity to come to this committee and to tell us what's wrong with our culture. And that tells us that something's wrong with our culture. But they might be more willing to talk to lawyers or human resources professionals outside the entity so that we could get that indirect feedback, whether it's reporters who cover us or lobbyists who seek to move legislation through these bodies. I think that if we had a task force of professionals that they could interact with, that we would get more frank and useful input on changes we might be able to make. And Madam Chair, I have at least 2 testifiers that I'm aware of, Lindsay Port and Aaron McQuaid.
I had Lindsay Port on it, but yes, they both may come up. Welcome to the committee, and if you could just start by introducing yourself for the record.
My name is Lindsay Port, and I'm here to testify in support of House File 3030. Chairwoman Pepin and committee members, thank you for taking the time to hear this bill, and thank you, Leader Hortman and Representative McQuaid and Becker-Finn for authoring it. I also want to thank you for the excellent testimony and discussions that have gone on in previous meetings of this subcommittee. Personally, I am very thankful for the weight and seriousness that you are giving these issues and the thoughtful way you've begun this process. As a candidate for the House in 2015, I was groped by then Representative Dan Schoen. I reported the harassment to a member of leadership who reported it internally. I was told he was disciplined, but since I was not an employee of the House, I was not privy to the details of the investigation or any repercussions. In the course of the following year, I began to hear stories from other women who had also been harassed by Mr. Schoen, as well as other legislators, including several instances after I had reported, making it clear to me that whatever system was set up to deal with this was not effective. In November of 2017, I, along with Representative McQuaid and Jamie Becker-Finn, went public about this harassment and joined in the national dialogue already in motion about sexual harassment in the workplace. We asked for an independent task force then and continue to believe it will bring forward the best possible outcomes for all parties. As a woman who has gone through the process currently in place, who tried to use the system that has been created by this legislature, I am here to tell you that the current system is woefully inadequate and needs an overhaul. The entire system deserves a thorough look from experts in this field who know the best practices, legal rights and requirements, appropriate privacy protections for the accusers and the accused, and how to build a system that balances all of those needs. Minnesotans deserve to come to the Capitol and interact with our lawmakers without the fear of harassment, and should have clearly defined, easily accessible system to report without the fear of repercussions and retaliations, and with the peace of mind that clear parameters for behavior have been set and appropriate discipline has been communicated and will be enforced. No matter if you're a candidate, a lobbyist, a lawmaker, a visitor, a staff member, journalist, or advocate, you should feel safe interacting with our legislators. In the political world, it's often unclear who is responsible for ensuring safe workplaces in different situations. Who is the boss of a legislator, a candidate? What if a member of leadership is the one that's harassed? I don't believe that the harassment that we brought forward and that others reported after us came as a surprise to very many of you sitting here today. Perhaps it felt like the system was the best that could be hoped for in this complex power structure of the Capitol. I'm here to tell you that as a constituent of this legislature, as a Minnesotan, as a mom, I demand better. And since this issue has been given to the subcommittee, I believe that it's your responsibility to ensure that we have the best possible system in place to advocate on my behalf and to take seriously our request for an independent task force. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Port, for coming forward. Representative McQuaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, committee. I won't take up too much time because I think what Lindsay said is really important. Having been a candidate when this first happened to me, there isn't that clear reporting structure because there is no boss of a candidate. Oftentimes their campaigns are on their own. It's a gray area. But I also want to say, now that being a representative, I see all the ways in which this body uses its own privilege to protect itself. We are exempted from the Data Practices Act. I wasn't privy to the details of the investigation that I was part of from the sexual harassment that I experienced. And so I want to make sure that as we are looking at this, the blinders that we often have for ourselves are removed, and the experts who do this every single day can tell us what we should look at to make sure that we are really changing the culture here. And the last thing I'll say is that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and I hope that the solutions brought forth by people who've experienced this harassment here at the legislature or by candidates is taken really seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do I have questions from members? Now I have a few. Representative O'Driscoll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's to the bill author. Representative Hortman, on line 2.18 in the duties and report required, it states at number 4, any other issues the task force determines relevant to ensure that the state capitol complex provides a safe and respectful work environment, and it continues on. Can you, as the bill author, give me maybe some kind of an idea of what that might be that we didn't enumerate in the bill that we just put in that catch-all category?
Thank you, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Representative O'Driscoll. Well, just to go through subdivision 2 in its entirety, what the task force would be charged with would be coming up with procedures for reporting, giving us advice on training, coming up with a nonpartisan process for receiving complaints for both us and outsiders. And then any other issues category is to allow those professionals to give us advice on topics that we may need advice on, but we didn't think to put in the request for the task force.
Chair.
Representative O'Driscoll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Hortman. And the only other question or clarification, I guess, is more than a question. A couple times today in your testimony, you indicated that law firms and human resource professionals in the Twin Cities area would be the appropriate people to go to. Are you not planning on including Greater Minnesota law firms and attorneys and resource professionals in the task force?
Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative O'Driscoll, I was just speaking to my experience as an attorney practicing in the Twin Cities for 23 years. And as an attorney practicing in the Twin Cities for 23 years, there is a robust community. Of course, that robust community does exist all over the state of Minnesota. At times when I had to give or receive continuing legal education seminars in other parts of the state, I would say that there's a robust community of employment law professionals and human resources professionals across the state. But I didn't interact with those folks as much as I did my Twin Cities colleagues.
Madam Chair.
Representative O'Driscoll.
Well, thank you for the clarification, Representative Hortman. As a Greater Minnesota legislator, I do get a little bit sensitive sometimes when we talk about the Twin Cities in relationship to the rest of Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Hortman.
Representative O'Driscoll, the other thing that I know is that attorneys bill by the hour, and that to the extent that they would give us their time, I guess in my mind, I did picture sort of downtown lawyers who are already very close, walking distance in the Skyway to the Minnesota State Bar Association and to their monthly employment law section meetings as being sort of a pre-existing group of professionals for whom it would not be a large inconvenience to add some public service work to the work that they're already doing. But I think to the extent we appoint a task force, we definitely need to think about getting perspective from other places.
Thank you. I do have a couple questions too. Do you have more questions? I have a few questions just on the task force itself. How would that work? I'm concerned about transparency. So it doesn't specifically outline in here that I can see, but so would legislators be able to testify in front of this task force? Would members of the public, lobbyists, media, how would we bring transparency to such a task force so that we could see what was going on and that we would, potentially be able to participate in the process?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that's a good question for House research on the typical construct that we put on task forces. I have 6 pages of task forces that this legislature has appointed over the years, and they function in a variety of mechanisms, some with very public conversations and some with more private interactions. I think the benefit of having a task force rather than a committee, if the 7 of us wanted to get together and talk about what should we do, just kind of bat around some ideas of how could we create a complaint mechanism for members of the media and lobbyists, and how should we deal with constituents who might have complaints. We would have to notice the committee, and we would have to record it, and the public would be here. And there wouldn't be that kind of free give and take. As long as we had a quorum of the committee, we couldn't have any sort of off-the-record discussion, those of us who are on this committee. My understanding is that a task force functions a little bit differently, and there's a little bit more of a casual work environment that's allowed. So there could be more of that kind of casual give and take where somebody has the space to throw out an idea that totally wouldn't work and that in retrospect might look dumb, but they can throw it on the table to get the conversation going. And that's not something we really have a great opportunity to do in this highly formalized committee structure that we have in the House.
So I guess I'm still not clear, though. So, I mean, presumably someone would have to give these task force members guidance. So would they be then required to, are you saying that it would be closed to the public and closed to people from testifying, or would it be open, or how, wouldn't we have to lay it out in this bill itself so that the parameters are clear to all involved, or how do you envision that happening?
Oh, well, Madam Chair, I think, again, House Research could give us perspective of the variety of different ways this has been handled, but I've participated in a number of processes on solid waste management so the legislature has had an issue brought to it and said, well, we don't have the expertise right now to solve this problem, so we're going to send MPCA and a bunch of industry professionals off to discuss. So whether it's people who are experts in construction demolition or municipal solid waste or waste to energy. And then there were a variety of informal meetings of those professionals who were appointed to the stakeholder groups. I think we had this in the paint industry before we got our paint stewardship bill passed. And I know we had the Solid Waste Commission in the 80s that was very, very successful. So I think there are a lot of different ways it can happen. But there are casual interactions that are less available to the public, but still there are opportunities for the public to give input to these groups that we've set up.
So then would the task force itself, I'm still not feeling like there's a clear answer, because I feel like, I mean, this is a very thoughtful proposal, but I feel like we would need to identify what the parameters are, because otherwise it would be the folks on the task force themselves that were deciding whether or not there would be transparency to the public, or whether what meetings would be closed to the public and which meetings weren't open. And I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to work through the process of how that would work, because I think that there could be a lot of room for us to be critiqued in that if we don't have any control over the parameters, you're basically going to have some people in here that don't necessarily have a strong connection to the legislature, that somebody is going to have to guide them into how this process would work and whether or not they should be taking testimony from legislators, from members, from the press, from the public, and unless we're guiding them and telling them. So I feel like if we were to go forward with a proposal, we'd have to be more clear on exactly what the expectations were. I don't think it would be very fair, in other words, to have some employment law attorneys who are a little bit out of their realm in this task force to ask them to decide for themselves. So if you could comment on that, and I don't know, and then Representative Freiberg, you can go after that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, we would get to decide what the parameters of the task force are as the legislature. But what I think I would assume that what the revisers did when I put my request up to the revisor's office is pick the structure that's most common, which is just we appoint the task force, we ask for a report after a certain period of time, and they have considerable freedom in who they talk to and how they conduct their work. Now, we could, of course, identify that we want them to have a certain number of public hearings to take input from the public. But my thinking in supporting the task force proposal is that it's the expertise of these individuals and their ability to have candor with each other that would be so valuable to us. So I trust that if we put together a group of 8 people, Speaker Dowd picking 2, me picking 2, Senator Bach picking 2, and Senator Gazelka picking 2, that we send those 8 professionals off to do some work, that I feel confident that they would give us recommendations that were useful. Now, of course, it's totally up to us of whether we would like to follow the recommendations of task forces. We are a little infamous here at the Minnesota Legislature for creating task forces and asking them to give us recommendations and then not following their recommendations. The ball is ultimately in our court. The question is just how can we put the best information in front of us as legislators to decide what to do going forward. The task force would not have the ability to put into place a complaint mechanism. They could advise to us a complaint mechanism that we could put in place, but ultimately the decision is still ours. Now, I think the concern that I heard expressed by some about forming a task force is the idea of losing control and maybe getting recommendations that we didn't want to follow. That's really a different problem. I mean, there's no risk of a task force making us do something we don't want to do. There is a risk of us getting advice that's good, that the public sees as good, that we don't choose to follow, and then that could be embarrassing. But I don't see that as a reason not to appoint a task force. I think Representative May-Quade had a response as well.
Representative May-Quade?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think Representative Hortman said this a little bit, but there could be a both and, a yes and, that sometimes this group is meeting, not so much in private, but themselves, to talk about issues, talk about our policies, and then they could also take public testimony. I know that since coming forward, I've had numerous women reach out to me with stories about numerous people at this legislature, and I would love a place for those folks to go tell their stories, but their privacy might also want to be protected as well. So there's a lot of ways that we could do this, but I think that a certain element of having conversations that are not private but not public testimony, and then also having that to be open for public testimony would be good for a task force.
Yeah, and to the point about losing control, I haven't heard that so much as it's just about sort of understanding the parameters and transparency to the public and what we will provide in that. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to go forward with this subcommittee, is that they're televised, it's completely open to the public, it's open for members, lobbyists, media, whomever to come forward. And I'm just concerned a little bit about that if we go forward with the task force, to making sure that that is crystal clear and that we're not sending these, poor 8 people out without giving them guidelines and how we want to go forward. So that would be my kind of concern on that front. We do have other member questions, then I have several more myself. I'm sorry, I guess I had Representative Fenton on the list first and then Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at line 1.6, Representative Horton, on the bill. Current members of the legislature, legislative staff, and lobbyists are not eligible for appointment. However, in a lot of the testimony today, we heard about how important it is to really give members of your HR a seat at the table if you really want to change the culture of the work environment. And we do have nonpartisan human resources. My question is, do you want to exclude them from this task force, or would it be beneficial to have a member of our nonpartisan human resources staff on the task force? They often hear more of what's going on around here, that we don't. So would that input be valuable to this task force and to have them be a part of it?
Representative Hortman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Fenton. I do think that the nonpartisan professional staff have valuable perspective to share, and they could certainly participate in the task force. But I think there is some value to having an independent task force. I think the public has a concern that we're not doing such a hot job of policing ourselves. And to the extent that we create a task force comprised of people who are answerable to the existing leadership structure and don't have independent employment security through some other mechanism, that we might end up getting advice that we've already sort of telegraphed that we would like to get back. And there also could be sort of a perception of a conflict of interest. I mean, our poor human resources staff is buried in this avalanche of issues that have arisen in light of the new culture that's emerging. As an older woman or middle-aged woman in the workforce, I can say things are really, really different. And young women today aren't putting up with things in the workplace that people in my generation put up with for decades. So things are changing, and our Human Resources Department is grappling with the reports that are coming forward here in our legislature and the complicated issues we're having to deal with. I think they have enough on their plate. Honestly, I really think we need some outside advice.
Representative Freiberg?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is kind of going to what you were asking about earlier, but I do notice that, on line 2.27 of the bill, it says that the Legislative Coordinating Commission must provide staff assistance support the work of the task force. You know, I'm looking just at the statutes setting up the legislative coordinating commission. You know, the membership of that commission consists of the majority leader of the Senate, the president of the Senate, 2 senators appointed by the majority leader, the minority leader of the Senate, 1 senator appointed by them. Anyway, it goes on. Lots of legislative membership there. You know, and I assume they have kind of a regular process for working through task forces and whatnot, and, you know, providing staff assistance to groups like this. I would be interested in hearing, you know, I don't know how this committee is exactly set up. Usually there's a member of House Research at the table. I do see House Research staff in the audience. I don't know if they'd be able to talk about the process that the Legislative Coordinating Commission and their staff uses to advise these task forces, but I assume it's there pretty regularly and they have a standardized process. So and there is oversight. It certainly sounds like there's oversight to the extent we want it in the membership of the LCC.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick, thank you for coming to the table.
Madam Chair, members, when we establish working groups, task forces, actual commissions through the LCC, typically the Director, Greg Hubinger, sits down with both the House and Senate nonpartisan staff and with his own staff, and we create a working group of staff. And everything from the typical work that a committee administrator would do in setting up the meetings to the expertise and various kinds of legal and policy analysis that are needed are done at the staff level. So for a task force like this, we would probably consult with Mr. Hubinger would put together personnel officers from House and Senate, probably some of our legal staff, and we would sit down with the 8 appointees and attempt to create a structure for hearings and meetings and ask them what they wanted to do and how they were going to implement the charge that the legislation or the work would do, and just basically put together a schedule. My general advice is that this continuum from what I call a working group, which can just be a group of people sitting in a room putting together their ideas on legislation or on policy, all the way to a full commission, is something that needs a lot of thought at each step about some of the protections of our regular legislative process. So what we would probably do with a group like this is urge them to meet in public and to make recordings and to be accessible, because what they're doing is trying to interface between the public and their concerns and the members and their concerns. And that's something that usually benefits from a more formal structure. But once again, we would talk to whoever was appointed and to the people and try to put together a work plan, review that with all 4 caucus directors, and sort of try to get buy-in in advance so that what came out the back end represented something that everybody at least understood the process. And the other thing I would note is that on something like this, Representative Hortman's dead right, there's nothing that is here that is not advisory. And in fact, it's not this legislature that would be dealing with this, it's the next legislature after the next election. And by having the right experts, the right legal advisors at the table, we can at least avoid some of the pitfalls that a number of these task forces get into, which is not understanding the legislative process or the lawmaking process. And that would be one of the goals that we would bring to the table, is to try to help integrate the outside experts with some of the internal process. And I worked on dozens of these, and some of them were great, and some of them didn't work very well.
Jeff, so, Mr. McCormick, as long as you're here, so to my earlier questions, since it doesn't specifically say exactly, it doesn't kind of address the topic of if these meetings would be public, if there'd be transparency required, would then, under your reading of this or under your comments you just made, would then that be determined by the members of the LCC, or would that be determined by the leaders that are defined in here, or would it be determined by the staff person in consultation with the 8 people that are actually on the task force? Who would decide exactly the schedule of whether they're, we're going to take public testimony, if legislators can testify, if it's open to the public, if they can talk to the media, things like that?
Madam Chair, members, we would probably talk to the authors, we'd talk to all 4 caucus directors, and we would talk to the members of the LCC and ask what their expectations are. I can tell you up front that my advice would be that we do as much in public as possible and that we avoid situations where major policies are being drafted in back rooms of the legislature, and instead that we should default to public hearings and we should default to public discussion. It doesn't mean that staff and that these people can't put together ideas behind the scenes and bring them to the public hearings. A lot of work goes on. When I draft a bill, it's happening in my office between me and the author. But in this case, I think that we want these things to alight as soon as possible in public.
Madam Chair.
Representative Hortman.
Mr. McCormick, I wonder if, not here, but after the committee, if you could give us an example of a work group that was successful, a task force that was successful, and a commission that was successful. So we could look at sort of the legislative construct that was put together that enabled a successful group. I know that this is a kind of a bare bones bill draft, and that when we actually seriously intend to move legislation forward and form a task force, we deal with the issues of whether they'll be compensated and all those details. I know this is an informational hearing. I don't know if it's the chair's intent to ever move the bill out of the Rules Committee or if it's here to die a quiet death after this informational hearing. But if we were to actually move the bill forward, I think we would want to look at the legislation that put into place other successful efforts.
Representative Freiberg, was this still on the same topic? Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess the question's for Mr. McCormick. It's just, since, I mean, you said your general recommendation was that the meetings be public, particularly given the charge to this task force, it seems like it would be dealing with potentially sensitive, potentially confidential facts relating to issues of sexual harassment that may have happened to lobbyists or staff or members. And there might be circumstances under which, you know, maybe their default rule might be to have their meetings be public, but there might be circumstances under which they'd want to take testimony in a setting that's not public. I mean, you know, we just, this past Friday, there was a report that came out dealing with one of the situations that led to this whole discussion and the creation of this committee, but the details of that report were not made public. I mean, and I'm not criticizing that decision. There's certainly probably very serious privacy concerns that arise with that. But do you think, I mean, in this sort of situation where you're dealing with these, might it be better to have a bill drafted with some flexibility to allow for situations where there might be somebody who's not comfortable coming forward in a public environment?
Mr. McCormick?
I'm sure members, we're just chatting with some of the personnel attorneys behind me. It's a kind of a question as to whether this group would take testimony from victims, people with actual complaints. And if they did that, you're right, they should probably consider procedures that would allow those to be taken in private, because privacy is one of the cornerstone concerns. If they're not taking that kind of testimony, if they're taking testimony more generically about how organizations deal with issues of discrimination and harassment, then they don't have to do that in public. And I think that's something where, if this was appointed, you'd talk to the appointees, you'd try to gather a scoping statement that determined whether that testimony would be part of the work plan, and if it was, I think we'd probably put together an opportunity for private testimony.
Thank you. And then I had another question, and I'm not sure if this is for you, Representative Hortman, or you, Mr. McCormick, but, well, maybe both. What do you envision for the media, since this has been, as you know, you and I and others have had multiple media requests on the issue. So how would that work with handling the media? Would the chairperson of the task force be the spokesperson for the group, or how do you envision that? And then maybe, Mr. McCormick, I'm not sure if other task forces, like Task Force on Solid Waste, gets the same amount of media attention, but how would it potentially be, or how has it been handled in the past?
I can tell you, Madam Chair, that Pat Kessler never called me the whole time I was going to those solid waste
Shocking.
task force meetings. I hadn't envisioned what we would direct the task force on dealing with the media. We certainly could put in the legislation. Again, I know this is an informational hearing, and so we're having a fairly hypothetical discussion here about what we would do if we were serious about moving this bill. But if we were serious about moving this bill, we could certainly put something in there that we would like the task force to be able to take confidential input from, lobbyists and media who aren't so willing to sit on this testifying table and give input to us, and we could request that they keep that information confidential. But, I don't know how in the weeds we want to get about what parameters we're going to give to a task force that sounds like is never going to exist.
Well, I would just say, we'll hopefully listen to all sorts of proposals and public testimony, and then hopefully we can bipartisanly, Ann Linchewski would kill me.
Rachel Lee Stassenberger.
And Rachel Stassenberger would kill me. So hopefully in a bipartisan way, we can come up with some recommendations. Did you have a comment on that, Mr. McCormick, if that had been an issue in the past, or maybe the other task forces haven't been quite as high profile?
Probably the highest, Madam Chair, probably the highest profile a task force I've worked on was the 35W bridge collapse investigation. And in that situation, we worked with a firm who we hired, and we basically told them we did not want them to go to the press until they had completed the report and controlled their conversations with the press more firmly. Outside experts don't work for us, and in outside expertise, we can ask them to be confidential. We can put something in a potential law, but they don't work for us, and so we have to be a little bit more careful about how we deal with our private data for someone who doesn't work with us. But that's something you could work out depending on how this was structured.
Yeah, I'm just trying to kind of work through it. And I was looking at that line as well with the LCC must provide staff assistance, and you kind of touched on this, that we'd have to kind of figure out what the per diem and mileage and stuff if we go forward, and how that would work. But it looks like, I'm assuming just kind of how it's written now, it would be a House employee potentially that is staffing this, that we would have to apparently write the report. So my question is, just kind of, I've heard several times of, we're the problem, and so we need to have outside experts because we're in the fishbowl. And that does make some sense. I fully understand that. But at some point, if we were to take any of these policies, we would have to presumably vote on them here anyway, just as we're going to have to vote on any policies we put forward that come out that we recommend to the full Rules Committee, and then, potentially to the rest of the body. So if you could just comment on that a little bit.
Yes, Madam Chair, I would not at all picture staff of the House or the Senate writing the report. I would picture the task force writing the report. I think the critical element here is getting the expertise of the outsiders to inform us. And I think that they would best be the people to do that work. But I'll make a commitment to you that if we have a real hearing on this bill where we're going to have a vote, where we talk about moving it through the process, that I will have in hand examples of the legislation that has pre-existed successful work groups in the past, and we can work through those issues. Given that this was an informational hearing and we're not actually talking about moving the bill today, I didn't do that research. It was my pretty clear understanding from the Speaker, the Majority Leader in the Senate, the Minority Leader in the Senate, that there was not yet a bipartisan interest in moving this process forward. But if you would like to have a hearing on the bill and a vote on the bill, then we can work on putting these details together. I would really love to work with you on putting a serious proposal together that might get bipartisan support from the leadership of the House and the Senate.
Hopefully we'll put together some policies or procedures that make this a better and safer workplace. So.